The first sound that ended Martha Sullivan's life was a gunshot, not the familiar crack of her late husband Frank's rifle putting down a sick animal. This was different. A panicked volley, a desperate reply, then a scream that tore the fabric of the blistering Arizona sky. That scream changed everything. It was the sound of a man being ripped apart, and it pulled Martha from the quiet life she'd built in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains and threw her head first into a story of blood, lies, and buried secrets. She was on her knees in her garden, the stubborn earth refusing to give life easily, when the shots echoed off the granite peaks. Her first instinct, the one Frank had drilled into her, was survival. Get inside, bar the door, grab the Winchester. It leaned by the hearth, a silent steel promise of safety. But the scream that followed wasn't a cry of rage. It was pure agony. It cut through her fear and hit something deeper, something maternal and achingly lonely that hadn't stirred in 2 years. Before she could think, she was running. Her gardening trowel fell from her hand, forgotten in the dirt. She scrambled to the edge of her property, to a large boulder that offered a sliver of cover, and peered into the shimmering heat. 4 riders, dark and hungry like wolves, were closing in on a fifth. The lone rider was hurt bad, swaying in the saddle, his arm hanging useless, a dark stain blooming on his shirt. His horse was running on pure heart, but it was fading fast. The horse stumbled. It went down in a cloud of dust and a tangle of limbs. The rider rolled free, pushing himself up on one elbow, his pistol still gripped in his hand. He was making his last stand. The 4 riders circled him, slow and cruel, savoring the kill. A cold fury rose in Martha's throat. She had watched her husband waste away from a fever, helpless against an enemy she couldn't see. This was an enemy she could see, and she could fight it. She didn't think, she acted. She sprinted back to the cabin, her hands steady as she grabbed the Winchester. She didn't go back to the boulder. Instead, she climbed the rocky hillock behind her home, the one that gave her a clear line of sight. Lying flat on the warm rock, she rested the rifle on a stone ledge. Frank's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes, Martha, the best way to stop a fight is to make them think a bigger one is coming. She didn't aim for the men. She aimed for a tall saguaro cactus 50 yards to their right. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, a deep, authoritative sound that dwarfed their pistol shots. A chunk of green flesh exploded from the cactus. The 4 riders jerked, their heads snapping in her direction. They couldn't see her. She fired again, this time at the dirt in front of the lead horse. Dust sprayed. The horse reared, its rider cursing. Doubt had entered their perfect equation. Was this an ambush? Their predatory confidence bled away, replaced by wary calculation. The leader, a big man with a thick beard, shouted an order. They fired a few more wild shots at the fallen man, then wheeled their horses and galloped away, swallowed by their own dust. Silence returned. Martha lay still for 10 long minutes, her heart hammering, scanning the empty horizon. Only when she was sure they were gone did she move. She approached the man cautiously, rifle ready. He was face down, his pistol lying in the dirt, beside his limp fingers. He was young, no older than 21, with sandy hair matted with sweat and blood. A ragged wound tore across his side. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were a startling hazel, now clouded with pain. "They gone?" he rasped. "They're gone," Martha confirmed. He tried to push himself up, then collapsed with a cry. "My thanks," he breathed, and then his eyes rolled back. He was out cold. The reality hit her like a physical blow. She stood alone on the vast, silent prairie, with a bleeding stranger at her feet. She had driven off one pack of wolves, but she knew the ways of the wild. Trouble, like a scavenger, is always drawn to the scent of blood. By saving this man, she hadn't ended her problem. She had just dragged it right to her front door. Dragging him back was a nightmare. He was a dead weight of wiry muscle, and his boots scuffed a pathetic trail in the dust, a clear signpost for anyone who might come looking. By the time she got him onto the braided rag rug in her cabin, her dress was stained with his blood and her arms burned. She barred the door, dropping the heavy crossbeam into place. The cabin, her sanctuary, felt small and suffocating, thick with the smell of blood and fear. The man on her floor was a bloody tear in the fabric of her quiet life. For a moment she just stared. His face in repose was boyish, freckled. He looked like the son she and Frank had always wanted. That thought, sharp and unwelcome, spurred her to action. She worked with grim efficiency. Water boiled over the hearth. She pulled out her small chest of remedies. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, willow bark for the pain, and a foul-smelling salve of comfrey and pine resin. With a skinning knife she cut away his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was a nightmare, a deep furrow gouged along his side. Thankfully, the bullet had passed through. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her hands surprisingly steady. He moaned in his unconscious state. She packed the wound with a paste of yarrow and wrapped his torso tightly with strips of linen torn from her bedsheets. As she worked, she took stock of him. His hands were calloused, but his fingers were long. His pistol, now on her table, was a Colt Peacemaker with a custom ivory grip, a gunslinger's weapon. His belt was high-quality leather. This was no simple ranch hand. She had to know who he was. Was he a wanted man? A killer? Her fingers found a worn leather wallet in his pocket. No money, just a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping advertising land in Oregon, dated 2 years prior. Tucked behind it was a tintype photograph. 4 young men, lean and tough, standing shoulder to shoulder with the same defiant set to their jaws. The man on her floor was the youngest, a cocky grin on his face in the photo. On the back, 4 names were faintly penciled: Jedediah, Silas, Bo, and Clay. As she put the wallet back, he started to stir. His eyelids flickered. He mumbled something, a slurry of words lost to fever. She leaned closer. "Brothers," he whispered, his voice a dry crackle. "Tell Jed. Kane." Then his eyes opened, just for a second, hazy with delirium, and focused on her. "Miller," he said, the name clear as a bell. "Name's Clay. Clay Miller." He was lying. The tintype said Clay, but it didn't say Miller. She tucked the photo back into his pocket, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. He was a stranger, bleeding on her floor, and his first conscious words to her were a lie. What was he hiding? The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The shadows grew long, turning familiar shapes sinister. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every hoot of an owl sounded like a signal. She had saved a man from 4 guns. But who had she actually invited into her home? The lie was more dangerous than the wound. Because a man with a secret is a man who is still being hunted. And the night was just beginning. Night fell like a sudden chilling void. The stars were so bright they seemed to mock the darkness below. Inside the cabin, the darkness was an accomplice to Martha's fear. She lit a single kerosene lamp, the wick low, its flickering light casting monstrous shadows. The Winchester wasn't by the hearth anymore. It lay across her lap as she sat in the rocking chair, facing the door. The man on the floor, this Clay Miller, was breathing more steadily, lost in a fevered sleep. He would occasionally cry out a name, Jed, or a fragmented warning. He was the calm center of a storm he had dragged into her life. Miles away, 3 riders moved through that same darkness with grim purpose. They weren't the men who had chased Clay. These men moved with an unnerving efficiency, their horses navigating the treacherous terrain like ghosts. They were Jedediah, Silas, and Bo Dalton. Jedediah, the eldest, rode at the point, his face a mask of resolve. He was the anchor, the strategist. To his right rode Silas, the hothead, his hand always near his Remington. He saw threats in every shadow. Behind them rode Bo, the quietest, the watcher. Jed was the mind, Silas the fist, and Bo was the soul of the Dalton brothers. They found the site of the ambush. Jed dismounted, his fingers tracing the story in the churned-up earth. He saw the circle of the attackers' horses, Clay's desperate stand, the spent cartridges from his Colt. Then he saw something else. Two larger rifle casings, a good distance away, from an elevated position. Winchester casings. Someone else was here, Jed said, his voice a low rumble. A witness. Or a partner, Silas spat. Jed ignored him, his eyes scanning the ground. The attackers rode east, fast. They were spooked. He pointed to a different set of marks. And this is where our boy went. He was dragged, heels digging in. Whoever fired that rifle, they took him. Bo knelt beside the tracks. One person, not heavy, small boots. He looked up at Jed. A woman. The word hung in the cold night air. Silas scoffed. A woman drove off Elias Kane's men. Not likely. Jed's jaw was tight. It doesn't matter, they have Clay. And we don't know if they're a friend patching him up or an enemy waiting to sell him. We treat them like an enemy until we know different. They mounted up and followed the trail. It was tragically easy, a clear, straight line to a single point of light flickering in the oppressive darkness. A lone cabin. They tethered their horses a few hundred yards out and approached on foot, melting into the landscape. They spread out, creating a perimeter. Jed took the front. Silas took the side, near the single window. Bo circled to the rear. Inside, Martha heard nothing, saw nothing, but a primal instinct, the one that tells the deer the wolf is near, made the hair on her arms stand up. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. She tightened her grip on the Winchester, staring at the thick wooden crossbeam on her door. It looked so flimsy. Then a floorboard on the porch creaked. It was a tiny sound, but she knew every noise her house made. This wasn't one of them. This was the sound of a man's weight. Her heart leaped into her throat. Another creak, closer. Then a deep, profound silence that was more terrifying than any sound. They weren't coming for her. They were already here. Just as she raised the rifle, a face appeared in the window. A brief, terrifying image, a man with cold eyes and a grim, set jaw, visible for a single second in the faint lamplight before vanishing back into the darkness. Panic seized her. They weren't just at the door. They were all around her. The wolves had surrounded her home, and the man on her floor, the liar, was the bait in a trap she had set for herself. The voice that came from the darkness wasn't a shout. It was a low, controlled rumble that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Ma'am, inside the cabin. We know you're in there. We know you have our brother." Martha's blood ran cold. The calm in his voice was terrifying. It was the calm of a man who knew he had already won. She raised the Winchester, its muzzle pointed at the center of the door. "He's hurt bad," the voice, Jedediah's, continued. "We're not looking for a fight. We just want him back. Open the door, and no harm will come to you." From the side of the cabin, another voice, Silas's, cut in, sharp and impatient. "Enough talk, Jed. Let's just kick the door in." "Silas, shut your mouth," the first voice snapped back. Martha's mind raced. Brothers. It had to be them. The men from the photograph. "He's alive," she called out, her own voice surprisingly steady. She had to turn their certainty into doubt. "But he's hurt bad, like you said, burning with fever." There was a pause. She had given them information, a sign she wasn't an enemy. "What's your name, ma'am?" Jed's voice asked, a fraction softer. Martha Sullivan, this is my home. She put an emphasis on the word home, trying to sound like a homesteader, not an accomplice. Well, Mrs. Sullivan, Jed said, his tone still edged with steel, we're grateful for you patching up our brother, but our patience is wearing thin. We need to see him. Now. I can't do that, she replied, her knuckles white on the rifle. I saw the men who shot him. For all I know, you're with them. Come to finish the job. It was a desperate gambit. Silas erupted. With them? With Elias Kane's filth? Lady, you don't know who you're talking to. The name again. Kane. The name the man on her floor had whispered. It was the key. Martha seized on it. I don't know any Kane, she said, her voice rising with a calculated mix of fear and defiance. I just know what I saw. I saw the brand on their horses, a black snake coiled around a spade. And I saw the lead rider, a big man with a thick black beard and a scar that splits his right eyebrow. I don't open my door to anyone until I know who they are. She was bluffing, adding details she'd heard Frank talk about once, years ago, stories of men he used to know, stories she'd tried to forget. This gave them pause. The details were too specific. It proved she was a witness, and a sharp-eyed one. A new, quieter voice spoke from the back of the cabin. It was Bo. She's telling the truth, Jed. That's Kane's lieutenant, Beardley. Only someone who got a good look would know about that scar. Inside, the wounded man moaned again, louder this time. Jed, is that you? His voice was weak, but clear enough to be heard through the door. This changed everything. Jedediah's voice lost all pretense of patience. That's it. We're done talking. Ma'am, you have 10 seconds to unbar that door before we take it off its hinges. 1, 2. Panic flared in Martha's chest. The ruse was over. Wait, she yelled. The counting stopped. You want to see your brother? Fine. But we do this my way. You, she directed at the first voice. The one called Jed. You come in. Alone. You leave your gun belt on the porch. You come inside with your hands empty and in the air. Your brothers stay put. One of them moves, I swear before God I'll put a bullet in you. It was an insane proposal. A lone woman dictating terms to 3 dangerous men. She could hear them whispering, Silas arguing furiously, but Jed's voice cut through. A long, tense silence followed. Martha held her breath, her rifle aimed at the door. Finally, Jed's voice came again, devoid of emotion. All right, Mrs. Sullivan. Your terms. She heard the heavy thump of a gun belt hitting the porch, then the sound of boots on the steps. The latch rattled. Slowly the door began to creak open. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, followed by the silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man. His hands were raised. His face was in shadow, but his eyes, glinting in the lamplight, were fixed on her, hard and unreadable. The reckoning was no longer at her door. It had just stepped inside. Jedediah Dalton filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the small cabin. He was tall and lean, a man made of rawhide and resolve. As he stepped inside, the lamplight caught his face. It was hard and weathered, with intelligent, weary eyes that missed nothing. They flickered from Martha and her unwavering Winchester to his brother on the rug, and then back to her. Easy now, ma'am, he said, his voice a low murmur. On your knees, Martha commanded. He gave a slight, humorless smile, but did as she said, lowering himself to the wooden floor. He was now at eye level with his brother. He reached out a hand, then stopped, looking at her for permission. Martha gave a curt nod. Jed gently placed his hand on Clay's forehead. He's burning up, Jed stated, his voice laced with concern. He looked at the clean bandaging, the bowl of bloodied water, the herbs on the table. He looked back at Martha, and a flicker of grudging respect crossed his face. You did this. I did, she said simply. You drove off Kane's men, and you patched up my brother. Most folks would have shut the door and pretended they heard nothing, or put a bullet in him themselves just for being a Dalton. Why didn't you? The name hit her. Dalton, not Miller. The man on her floor wasn't just a liar, he was one of the infamous Dalton brothers. She had saved a Dalton, the most wanted and most loyal family of outlaws in the territory. Her blood ran cold. The danger she was in had just magnified tenfold. He told me his name was Miller, she said, the rifle not wavering. Jed's eyes narrowed. He looked at Clay, a flash of disappointment crossing his face. He's young and foolish. He turned his gaze back to Martha. I asked you a question. Why help him? Martha thought of Frank, of the helplessness she'd felt. I'm tired of watching men die for no reason, she said. He was dying. That was enough. Jed seemed to accept this. He turned back to Clay, whose eyes were fluttering open. Jed, Clay breathed. Martha, she saved me. Jedediah looked from his brother's trusting face to the resolute woman with the rifle. The pieces were falling into place. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his tone changing from a threat to a negotiation. You've bought yourself a conversation, but Kane's men will be back. And when they realize it was just one rifle, they won't knock. He was right. Her bluff was a temporary fix. What do you want? She asked, the Winchester feeling impossibly heavy. Let my brothers in, Jed said. Let us fortify this cabin. We'll give you our word, the word of a Dalton, that you will not be harmed. We aren't your enemies, ma'am. Elias Kane is. He's the enemy of anyone who stands between him and what he wants. And what does he want? Jed's eyes darkened. It's not money. Not this time. We acquired something of his, a business ledger. It details every bribe he's paid, every official he owns from here to the territorial capital. It's his death warrant. He thinks Clay has it. Does he? Jed hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. No, he said, a little too quickly. It's safe. Another lie. Or at least not the whole truth. Martha saw it in his eyes. He didn't know where the ledger was, and he suspected Clay had lost it. The whole affair snapped into terrifying focus. This wasn't a simple posse. This was a war between two lawless factions over a piece of paper that could bring down the whole territory. And her cabin was now the battlefield. Her options were stark. Trust these infamous lying outlaws, or face Kane's entire gang alone. She had already chosen a side when she fired her rifle. She was just now realizing the consequences. Slowly she lowered the barrel of the Winchester. All right, she said, her voice a whisper. Bring them in. But their guns go on the table. They will, Jed promised. He went to the door and opened it. Silas, Bo, stand down. We're invited. A moment later, the other two Daltons entered. Silas was a coiled spring of suspicion. Bo was calmer, nodding respectfully to Martha before his gaze settled on his youngest brother. As promised, they unbuckled their gun belts and laid their formidable collection of pistols and rifles on her small dining table. The metallic clang was the sound of a truce being struck. But as Silas laid his Remington down, something fell from his belt. A small, tarnished silver locket. It rolled across the floor and stopped at Martha's feet. She bent to pick it up. As her fingers closed around it, she felt a jolt of ice in her veins. She didn't have to open it. She knew the intricate floral pattern etched into its surface. She knew the broken clasp. It had been her mother's, and it had been on Frank's body the day she buried him. The cabin, once a place of quiet solitude, was now a humming hive of tense activity. But for Martha, the world had gone silent. The locket felt cold in her palm. How did this man, this violent stranger, have the one thing she believed she had buried with her husband 2 years ago? The Dalton brothers moved with a practiced efficiency. Jed directed them with quiet commands, fortifying the cabin. Bo took the window. Silas checked the back wall. They were preparing for a war, oblivious to the one that had just exploded inside Martha's mind. Frank died of a fever. That's what the doctor from Contention had said, a wasting sickness that took him in his sleep. She had held his hand as he grew cold. She had washed his body for burial herself. The locket, a family heirloom, had been his wedding gift to her. He'd asked to be buried with it. Bo approached her, his gentle eyes a stark contrast to his brother's. "Ma'am, permission to get some water for Clay?" Martha just stared at him, unable to speak, her hand clenched around the locket in her pocket. He mistook her silence for fear. "Thank you for what you did," he said quietly. "Clay. He's foolish sometimes, but he's got the best heart of any of us." "Why are you all living this life?" The question slipped out, a desperate attempt to understand, to connect this violent present to her shattered past. Bo sighed, a weary sound. "Our father was a farmer. A banker took it all. Jed swore we'd never be powerless like that again. Guess we just went too far in the other direction." He gave a sad, lopsided smile. "Stopped being victims, ended up becoming the thing we hated." Silas, the one whose belt had betrayed the secret, paced the room like a caged animal. He still looked at Martha with distrust. "You only got this one rifle?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "It's all I've ever needed," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. He grumbled, his eyes flicking to the pile of weapons on the table, then to Jed, clearly unhappy with being disarmed. Jed turned his attention to Martha. "Mrs. Sullivan, you know this land. Are there any approaches to this cabin we can't see?" She forced herself to think, to focus. The locket felt like a burning coal in her pocket. "There's a dry creek bed," she said, her voice hollow. "It runs about 200 yards north. Comes up behind the hill I was on." Jed's eyes narrowed. "They could flank us." He cursed under his breath. As the hours crept by, an uneasy rhythm settled. Martha brewed coffee. The men drank it in silence. Clay had regained more of his senses and looked at her with profound gratitude. "Ma'am, we owe you a debt we can't ever repay." She couldn't look at him. She looked at Silas. She had to know. She waited until Jed and Bo were busy barricading the window. She approached Silas, holding out the locket in her palm. "Where did you get this?" His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. "Found it," he said too quickly. "Off a dead man, a gambler in a backroom game who tried to cheat me." "What did he look like?" Martha pressed, her voice trembling. Silas shrugged. "Tall, dark hair, had a cough that sounded like death was rattling in his chest." He was describing Frank in his final weeks. It was a lie, a poorly constructed lie. Silas was hiding something, something to do with her husband. It was Bo staring out the window who broke the tension. His voice was a low, urgent whisper. "Ryder. Far Ridge." Instantly the men were on their feet. Jed grabbed a pair of field glasses. "Just one," he confirmed. "A scout. It's Kane's man. I recognize the horse. He's not attacking. He's watching." The air in the cabin grew thick and cold. The waiting was over. "He'll go back and report," Jed said grimly. "He'll tell Kane there are 4 horses here now. He'll tell him the Daltons have dug in. Kane won't be cautious anymore." He turned from the window, his face set like stone. "They'll wait for the dawn. They'll want the light to shoot by." He looked at his brothers, then at Martha. "Get what rest you can. When the sun comes up, so does hell." There was no rest. As they prepared for the assault, Martha's mind reeled. Frank hadn't died of a fever. Silas's lie was too transparent. The locket was proof. He had been murdered. And these men, these Daltons, were connected to it. Were they his killers? Or something else? The pieces didn't fit. Why would they come here? Why would fate bring her husband's murderers and their wounded brother to her doorstep? Jed handed her a pistol from their pile. "Keep this close," he said, his eyes showing a sliver of trust. She took it, its weight cold and alien. As the first blush of gray lightened the eastern sky, Jed peered through a crack in the wall. "They're here, at least 8 of them. They're using that creek bed, just like you said." The attack began with a single, perfectly aimed shot that slammed into the wall inches from Jed's head. Then the world erupted. Gunfire exploded from 3 sides. Lead punched through the log walls. Martha threw herself to the floor, her heart pounding. Amid the chaos, she watched Silas. He fought with a terrifying rage, screaming curses. But she saw something else in his eyes. Guilt. Every time he looked at her, he looked away. Clay, propped against the wall, fired his Colt through the window. He winced in pain, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. "The ledger," he muttered, his mind clouded with fever. "It's safe. Told Jed. Safe with Frank's old map, in the hollow stone, by the creek." Martha froze. The hollow stone by the creek. It was her and Frank's special place. A loose rock in the foundation of her own hearth. She had seen him tucking an old oilskin pouch in there just days before he died, telling her it was insurance for the future. Could it be? Had Kane's ledger been in her home this entire time? The fight became a blur of noise, smoke, and adrenaline. Martha crawled to a gap between the logs. She saw 2 men moving from rock to rock. She remembered Frank's words. "Breathe out and squeeze." She fired. The man fell. A sickening lurch twisted her stomach, but there was no time for remorse. She worked the lever, chambering a new round. The Daltons fought like a single beast. Jed was the cool-headed tactician. Silas was a force of nature. Bo was a methodical marksman. Even Clay, pale with pain, was firing. The initial assault was repelled, but it was just a lull. "They're regrouping," Jed shouted. "They'll try to burn us out next." As if on cue, a flaming arrow arced through the sky and thudded into the dry wood of the roof. Another followed. "Silas, the roof," Jed commanded. Silas climbed onto the table, prying at the ceiling boards to get to the flames. It was then that the front door exploded inwards. A massive figure, the bearded man with the split eyebrow scar, charged through the splintered wood, a shotgun leveled. Before anyone could react, Bo fired his rifle from his hip. The big man was thrown backward, but the cost was high. As Bo turned, a bullet from outside tore through the opening, catching him in the thigh. He cried out and collapsed. Chaos reigned. Silas dropped from the ceiling to help his brother. Jed laid down, covering fire. Seeing his chance, Elias Kane himself stepped through the doorway. He was tall and lean, with cold, dead eyes, and he raised his Spencer rifle, aiming for Jed, whose back was turned. Martha saw it all. She dropped her rifle and drew the pistol. "Kane!" she screamed. He turned, his eyes locking with hers. A flicker of shock crossed his face, followed by a cruel, dawning recognition. "Sullivan," he snarled. "Frank's woman. I should have known he'd leave a mess behind." Frank's woman. The words confirmed everything. Frank wasn't a victim. He was part of their world. "He was supposed to be my partner," Kane bellowed over the gunfire. "But he got soft, stole my ledger, and ran off with you." In that split second, 2 years of lies unraveled. Frank hadn't died of a fever. He had betrayed the most dangerous man in the territory. The Daltons weren't his killers. They were his allies trying to finish what he started. Silas hadn't killed Frank. He had likely been with him when he died, taking the locket as a keepsake for his fallen friend. Everything she knew was a lie. Everything but the man aiming to kill everyone in her home. Kane swung his rifle towards her. "The ledger is mine, and so is his pathetic legacy." In that instant of hesitation, Martha fired. The pistol jumped, the sound deafening. A red flower blossomed on Kane's chest. He stared at her, his expression of shock turning to vacant confusion, before he crumpled to the ground. Silence. The sudden, ringing silence was more shocking than the noise had been. The surviving members of Kane's gang, their leader dead, lost their nerve and vanished back into the prairie. The sun was now fully risen, its golden light pouring through the smoke-filled, bullet-riddled cabin. It illuminated a scene of utter devastation. Clay was trying to get to Bo, who was bleeding badly. Silas was pressing a rag to Bo's wound, his face a mask of anguish. He looked at Martha, and his eyes were filled with a silent apology. Jedediah Dalton stood over the body of Elias Kane, then looked at Martha. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended words. He knew she had just discovered the truth. They left an hour later. They patched up Bo and loaded him onto his horse. The surviving Dalton brothers stood on her porch, their faces bruised and powder-stained. Her home was nearly destroyed. Jed stepped forward, holding a heavy leather pouch. "Mrs. Sullivan, this won't fix the damage, but it's a start." Martha shook her head. "I didn't do it for money." "I know," he said softly. He placed the pouch on the porch rail anyway. "Take it. Not as payment, but as a tool to rebuild. Frank. He was a good man. He just got in over his head. He wanted a different life for you." Silas finally met her gaze. He held out the locket. "He told me to give this back to you if I ever saw you again," he said. He was sorry. Martha took the locket, her past and present colliding in her hand. Clay, leaning on his horse, met her eyes. "Martha," he said, using her first name for the first and last time. "Thank you." She just nodded, unable to speak. She watched as they rode away, 4 figures heading west into the vast, indifferent landscape. They didn't look back. Martha Sullivan stood alone on her porch, the rising sun warming her face. She looked at the destruction, at the bodies that lay in the dust. Her quiet life was gone, shattered forever. But as she stood there, the Winchester in one hand, a new, unfamiliar strength in her heart, she knew she was not broken. She was a survivor. She walked back inside, knelt at the hearth, and pulled loose the hollow stone. Inside was an old oilskin pouch. She opened it. It wasn't just a ledger. It was Frank's confession. A letter to her explaining everything, and enough money to start a new life anywhere she wanted. Her husband hadn't left her a mess. He'd left her the truth. And a choice. Her story became another whispered legend of the frontier, a testament to the fact that heroism isn't always found in a lawman's badge. Sometimes it's found in the quiet resolve of a lone woman who, when faced with the wolves of the world, decides not to hide but to fight back. Her tale reminds us that the past is never truly buried, and the line between right and wrong is often drawn not in ink, but in dust and blood. It raises the question, what would you have done? Would you have barred the door? Or would you have picked up the rifle? If this journey back into the forgotten corners of the American West stirred something in you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this story with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit. Most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories like Martha's waiting in the shadows, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.